Okay, uh, now I'd like to discuss the final stage of moral reasoning within the final level, post-conventional morality, according to Kohlberg. So the final stage, stage six, is referred to as universal principles. In some cases, I've also heard it referred to as the philosopher king stage. This is the final stage of moral development, moral reasoning. It's the highest stage. Kohlberg says that very few people actually attain this stage of moral reasoning. Although we might argue that things have changed, and we'll look at some of the critiques at the very end of the lecture here. But stage six, this universal principle stage, is an understanding of morality that is universal. That morality is it's not necessarily defined externally to the individual nor internally. It just exists objectively. What's morally right is universally morally right in all social contexts, and what's morally wrong is universally morally wrong in all social contexts as well. Now, of course, at the micro level, we could look at kind of cultural relativism and how that comes into play with certain kind of micro phenomena. But on a macro level, this is a kind of understanding of morality that applies in all social contexts. So in this stage, principles of justice are universal and apply to all parties. Morality is not determined by societal laws, rules, or norms. Morality exists independently of societal laws, rules, and norms. And in this conception, norm violations, so essentially deviance, in some cases, we might be talking about crime actually here, violation of a legal norm, is acceptable if the social norms suppress human rights. So I have a photo here taken in 2011 during the Arab Spring revolts. This was taken in Tahrir Square in Egypt, and you see protesters flying the Egyptian flag. You see a protester with a sign that says "Together Against Injustice." And these folks came out to protest what they perceived as unjust practices undertaken by the Mubarak regime, who had, exerted very kind of repressive and heavy-handed control over Egyptian society for over 20 years. This was a non-democratic regime. Although they did hold elections regularly, many of the elections were sham elections, and political participation was discouraged. This was, a kind of sectarian regime in many ways that provided opportunity to some based on their religious affiliation or their ethnic identity and denied it to others. This was a regime that was characterized by abuses against its citizens. So security forces and military both had, been accused of kind of repressive tactics for many, many years. And so many of these protesters were coming out in violation of, legal codes that restricted gatherings in public spaces and restricted the right to protest. Were essentially violating the law in order to promote what they believed was just and what was right. So, extending the kind of motivations from the previous stage, stage five, stage six also says that when, laws are perceived as unjust, individuals should challenge those laws. Another aspect of stage six within the post-conventional level is that individual freedom should be maintained unless that individual freedom happens to impinge upon another's freedom. So, in the United States, we have the freedom of speech. This is guaranteed in the Constitution under the First Amendment. But the freedom of speech doesn't cover hate speech. It doesn't cover speech that promotes violence against individuals or population groups. So there are limits to free speech. And if we're looking at, kind of free speech laws using Kohlberg's theory of morality development, then we might argue that the free speech laws, or those who developed the free speech laws in the United States, were operating under the kind of premises of stage 6, that speech is not limited unless that speech might be seen to violate the freedom or the liberty of another. Now I have a couple other examples. I have gun rights, I have abortion, I have cannabis legalization. I have question marks near those because these are political issues that I'm not taking any kind of stance on here in this lecture, but I'm just asking, do these individual rights, such as the right to own a firearm, which is guaranteed by the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, does that right impinge upon the rights of others? Some might argue that it doesn't, and then others might argue that, there are about 30,000 firearm deaths in the United States. Half of those are self-inflicted, the other half aren't. We have more mass shootings here than most other developed nations, or definitely than all other developed nations and than most other nations in general. So we could ask that question, do gun rights, the rights for an individual to own a firearm, does that violate the kind of liberty of someone else? Abortion, cannabis legalization, these questions we can run the same type of analysis on. Do reproductive rights for some, the freedom to choose, does this violate the rights of others? Some might argue that it violates the rights of a fetus, and then we could debate whether fetuses are allotted rights by a given society. Whatever your stance is on these issues, I think is inconsequential, but just thinking about, how these debates kind of tie in with this stage of moral reasoning is really the point here. Getting back to the kind of focus on justice for each stage. In this stage, justice is distributed collectively, but not just collectively. We're not just trusting the criminal justice system to administer justice appropriately. Justice is administered and distributed proportionate to the circumstances or need. So, this is where we might see a focus on rehabilitation over retribution. So, instead of assigning individuals long, lengthy sentences of incarceration for violating legal norms, committing crime, we might focus on rehabilitating. You see this, I think you've seen some changes in the U.S. criminal justice system towards rehabilitation, some effort to reform the prison system, by, say, providing education or training or mental health services within these institutions. But I think in many ways our criminal justice system is still geared towards retribution. We still do tend to assign longer sentences here in the United States for similar crimes when compared with other developed nations. We might also be looking at restorative justice. So restorative justice is kind of a hot term now in fields of criminology and criminal justice, but this is the idea that you really reconcile the kind of legal norm violation or criminal activity, the consequences of that with the community, with the victims, and coming to some sort of kind of restorative conclusion is really paramount here. Another key point for stage 6 in Kohlberg's model of moral reasoning is that this is a stage that is very rare, is quite uncommon, because it may entail huge risks, right? So, those protesters who were out in Tahrir Square were taking big risks with their lives, with their safety, and maybe even with the safety of those that they love. Some were killed, some were beaten. There was many reports of sexual violence, particularly against female protesters. So this was a very dangerous affair. Those protesters pro-democracy, non-violent protesters who came out in Syria in 2011 to protest the Assad regime, they, were taking incredible risks, and those nonviolent protests were quickly met with sniper fire, barrel bombs, and overwhelming violence. So, if we're going to kind of assert, or try to overlay this stage of moral reasoning on those individuals, we might look at some of the risks that they took to promote their understanding of what's morally right, and their kind of desire for freedom and self-determination. Other examples, I think common examples that are used to illustrate post-conventional morality are individuals like Nelson Mandela, who served over 10 years in prison in South Africa, leader of the anti-apartheid movement, Martin Luther King, who lost his life promoting racial justice in the United States, and other activists, who have sacrificed their lives, their livelihood, their safety in order to promote their idea of what's morally right.